A woman with sleepwalking sets up a camera to monitor herself at night. At first, the recordings are just funny. But then she watches a video where her sleeping body is staring blankly at her own hands, while her reflection in the mirror turns to the camera and gives a wide, unnatural smile. Anna had suffered from it since childhood. Sleepwalking was her secret curse, an invisible companion that rented her body while her mind was dormant. In the mornings, she would find only the evidence of its nocturnal wanderings: the refrigerator door left ajar, books rearranged on the shelves, the faint, muddy prints of her own bare feet on the clean kitchen floor. It was a violation, a nightly haunting performed by her own flesh and blood, a stranger who wore her face and slept in her bed. She was a ghost in her own life, a passenger in a vessel she could not control. To take control of this nocturnal doppelganger, to cage the ghost, she installed a small camera in the corner of her bedroom. It was a simple, modern solution to what felt like an ancient affliction, an attempt to shine the sterile light of technology on the shadows that moved within her. She aimed it to cover the bed and the large, full-length mirror that hung on the opposite wall, hoping to map the boundaries of her unconscious self, to finally see the face of the tenant who walked in her skin while she was away. It was an act of surveillance against her own body. The first few nights of reviewing the footage brought only a wry, uneasy smile. There she was, at 3 a.m, walking with a solemn purpose to the kitchen, eating cold spaghetti directly from the container with a spoon, and then returning to bed, muttering incomprehensible nonsense. It was amusing. It was strange, a bizarre and private theater of the absurd, but it felt safe. The sleepwalker was a creature of simple, harmless appetites. The recordings were proof that her curse was a quirk, not a true menace, and she began to feel a sense of detached control over it. It had become a morning ritual, fast-forwarding through the gray, silent footage with a cup of coffee, cataloging the harmless antics of the night before. But one morning, while scrubbing through another night's recording, her finger froze on the mouse. The footage was typical at first. She had risen from the bed, as usual, and had walked not to the kitchen, but toward the large mirror that stood against the wall. She stood before it for a long, still moment, her sleeping self simply observing her own reflection in the dim, infrared light of the camera. Then the anomaly occurred. On the video, her physical body began to turn away, to retreat back to the safety of the bed. But her reflection hesitated. It lingered for a fraction of a second, a delay of no more than 3 frames of footage. For that brief, impossible instant, the figure in the mirror remained perfectly still, its head tilted, its gaze fixed not on her, but directly into the camera's lens. It was a look of cold, calm, and undeniable awareness. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement that did not quite match her own, it caught up, turning and melting back into a perfect, synchronous copy. She replayed the moment. Again and again. The strange, safe amusement of her nightly wanderings was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp splinter of unease. The lag was almost imperceptible, a blink and you miss it glitch that a less observant person would have easily missed. But it was there. It was an objective, undeniable fact, recorded in digital code. The reflection had not simply followed her. For a fraction of a second, it had asserted its own independence. It had watched. And the safe, predictable world she had so carefully constructed around her secret curse suddenly felt very fragile. She dismissed it as a technical glitch. Her rational mind, desperate to maintain its grip on a logical, predictable world, immediately began to construct a wall of plausible explanations. It was a video compression artifact, a common phenomenon where fast movements create ghosting and delays in the recorded image. It was the camera's cheap optics, a flaw in the lens that was distorting the reflection. It was a complex and unfortunate play of light and shadow in the dim, infrared-lit room. She clung to these explanations, repeating them to herself like a mantra, a prayer against the encroaching, irrational fear. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it began to grow in the fertile soil of her anxiety. That night, she adjusted the camera's settings. She moved it closer to the mirror, ensuring a clearer, more direct view. She increased the frame rate to its maximum setting, a technical adjustment designed to capture fast motion with greater clarity, to eliminate the very possibility of the ghosting she had so desperately tried to convince herself was the cause. She was setting a trap, not for her sleepwalking self, but for the anomaly, for the ghost in the glass. She was daring the phenomenon to repeat itself under more stringent, scientific conditions. The next morning, she approached the computer with a sense of trepidation that was almost a premonition. Her hands were trembling slightly as she opened the new video file. She fast-forwarded through the long, uneventful hours of her sleep, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat in her chest. And then, at 2:17 in the morning, she saw it. Her sleepwalking self rose from the bed, a familiar, ghostly figure in the gray, monochrome light, and walked, as it had the night before, to the mirror. The experiment was about to begin. She held her breath, her eyes locked on the screen. The anomaly not only repeated itself, it had grown stronger, more confident. This time, the delay was not a fleeting, three-frame glitch. It was a long, deliberate, and utterly undeniable pause. For nearly a full second, her physical body stood before the mirror, swaying slightly, a puppet with its strings momentarily slack. But her reflection was a statue. It was perfectly, unnaturally still, a frozen, high-resolution portrait of herself. The two figures, the real and the reflected, were completely, demonstrably out of sync. The wall of her rationalizations, so carefully constructed, was beginning to crumble. And then, the moment that shattered the wall completely. Her physical body, its strange, silent communion with the mirror apparently over, began to turn away, to retreat back toward the bed. But the reflection did not follow. It remained standing, facing forward, its gaze still fixed on the room. And then, as her real body continued its journey back to the bed, the reflection did something of its own. It moved with a slow, fluid grace that was utterly different from her own sleep-dazed movements. It tilted its head slightly to the side, a gesture of calm, intelligent, and deeply unnerving curiosity. It was a small, subtle movement, but it was a declaration of independence. It was the gesture of an observer, a scientist studying a curious specimen. The reflection was not just a passive copy, it was an active participant, an entity with its own agency, its own thoughts, its own intentions. It was watching its original, its source, with a detached, analytical gaze, and in that simple, elegant tilt of the head, Anna felt a profound and terrifying sense of being scrutinized, of being judged by the thing that wore her own face. She replayed the moment a dozen times, her scientific experiment in demystification now transformed into a horrified, obsessive study of the impossible. She zoomed in on the reflection's face, searching for any sign of a digital artifact, any pixelation or distortion that would betray it as a trick of the light. But the image was perfect, crystal clear. The curiosity in the reflection's eyes was not a product of a faulty lens, it was a product of a consciousness. There was no doubt left in her mind. This was not a lag. This was an action. The nature of her curse had fundamentally changed. She was not just a sleepwalker. She was the host to something else, something that lived not in her body, but in her reflection. The camera, which she had installed to monitor her own unconscious movements, had inadvertently captured the awakening of another entity, a silent, watchful twin that lived in the cold, two-dimensional world behind the glass. The fear she felt was no longer the vague, manageable anxiety of a medical condition. It was the sharp, specific, and existential terror of being haunted, not by a ghost, but by herself. Her bedroom, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a shared space she was forced to occupy with a silent, watchful entity. The large, elegant mirror, which had been a simple piece of furniture just days before, now seemed like a portal, a window into another dimension where a colder, more intelligent version of herself resided. She avoided looking at it during the day, catching only fleeting, furtive glimpses of her own face, terrified that she might see a flicker of movement, a hint of the other's presence, even in the bright, unforgiving light of day. The nightly ritual of reviewing the footage became a form of self-torture, a compulsion she could not resist. She had to know what the other was doing, how it was evolving. She was a scientist in a horror story, and her own soul was the subject of the experiment. The sleepwalking was no longer the focus of her attention, it was just the catalyst, the event that brought the two worlds, the real and the reflected, into contact. The real horror began when her sleeping self stood before the mirror, a nightly, unwitting communion with the thing on the other side. And with each new night, the entity in the glass grew bolder, its actions more pronounced, more independent. It was testing the boundaries of its existence, exploring the limits of its newfound freedom. One night, it smiled while her own face was slack and emotionless. Another night, it raised a hand and waved, a small, mocking gesture of greeting. It was learning, growing, evolving, and Anna was its helpless, terrified witness, a zookeeper watching a strange and beautiful new predator test the bars of its cage, knowing that it was only a matter of time before it figured out how to get out. The nights became a torment, and the days a feverish, obsessive wait for the morning's viewing. Sleep was no longer a refuge, but a nightly surrender, a period of terrifying vulnerability where she was forced to share her most private space with a silent, watchful entity. She began to dread the sunset, the encroaching darkness that signaled the start of her nightly ordeal. The morning ritual of reviewing the footage, once a source of wry amusement, had become a grim, compulsive duty, a daily cataloging of the escalating horror that was unfolding in her own bedroom. With each new recording, the her in the mirror grew bolder, more confident, its actions more brazenly independent. The initial, subtle delays and head tilts had been a period of quiet observation, of testing the waters. Now, the entity was actively experimenting, exploring the boundaries of its strange, reflected existence, and its explorations were becoming increasingly, deliberately menacing. It was no longer just an anomaly, it was a presence, and it was beginning to enjoy its performance for the camera. One night, the footage showed her sleepwalking self standing not before the mirror, but in the center of the room, her head bowed, her hands held out in front of her as if she were examining them under a microscope. It was a strange, nonsensical gesture, the kind of bizarre, dream logic action she had become accustomed to seeing. But when she glanced at the reflection in the mirror, which was partially visible in the corner of the frame, she felt a jolt of pure, visceral revulsion. The reflection was not looking at its hands. It was looking directly into the camera. And it was smiling. It was not her smile. It was a grotesque, predatory baring of teeth, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched her features into a monstrous, inhuman mask. It was a smile of pure, malevolent glee, the smile of a tormentor who knows they are being watched and is relishing the fear they are creating. The contrast between her own placid, sleep-dazed face and the ravenous, joyful horror of the reflection's grin was a dizzying, nauseating violation of the natural order. She was looking at a picture of her own face contorted into the very image of madness. Another night, the performance took a different, more intimate, and somehow even more terrifying turn. The footage showed her, as usual, approaching the mirror. But this time, instead of just standing and observing, her sleepwalking self reached out and placed a hand flat against the cool, smooth surface of the glass. It was a gesture of connection, a strange, unconscious attempt to bridge the gap between the two worlds. For a long moment, the reflection mirrored the action perfectly, its own hand pressed against hers from the other side, a perfect, symmetrical image of self-contemplation. Then, as her real body dropped its hand and began to turn away, the reflection did not follow. It remained in place, its hand still pressed against the glass. And as Anna watched, her breath caught in her throat, the reflected hand began to move. It slid slowly, languidly down the surface of the mirror, its fingers leaving no print, no smudge, no trace of its passage. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking longing, the touch of a prisoner caressing the bars of their cell, a silent, desperate plea for release. And then came the night that solidified her terror into a cold, hard certainty that she was in the presence of not just a strange phenomenon, but a hostile intelligence. Her sleepwalking self had not even gotten out of bed that night. She had simply tossed and turned, caught in some restless, unremembered dream. But the camera, which was still pointed at the mirror, had captured something else. For hours, in the empty, silent room, the reflection had been active. It had paced back and forth within the confines of the mirror's frame, a caged animal, its movements sharp, agitated, and full of a palpable, frustrated energy. She watched the footage in a state of horrified, hypnotic fascination. The reflection was not just a copy, it was a separate being, with its own life, its own consciousness, its own frustrated desires. It was trapped in its two-dimensional world, a silent, eternal prisoner, and it was aware of its captivity. It was aware of her, the original, the one who was free to move in the three-dimensional world, and in its agitated pacing, she could feel its envy, its resentment, its growing, impotent rage. It was a parasite, and she was the host, and it was beginning to hate her for her freedom. She had to stop it. She had to break the connection. That evening, before going to bed, she took a heavy blanket and draped it over the mirror, covering its entire surface, plunging the other into a world of absolute, suffocating darkness. It was a primitive, superstitious act, a child's defense against the monster under the bed, but it was all she could think of to do. She would cut off its view. She would sever the link. She would blind the watchful, malevolent eye that had been tormenting her. She went to sleep that night with a small, fragile sliver of hope. The next morning, she rushed to the computer, her hand shaking as she opened the video file. She fast-forwarded through the night, her eyes scanning the gray, monochrome footage for any sign of movement. Her sleepwalking self had not risen. The blanket-draped mirror was a large, inert, lump in shape against the wall. It had worked. She felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her weep. She had won. She had silenced the ghost. She was about to close the file when she noticed something. A slight, almost imperceptible movement near the bottom of the mirror. She rewound the footage, her heart pounding in her chest again. She played it back in slow motion, her eyes glued to the screen. And then she saw it. The blanket, which she had tucked securely around the frame of the mirror, was moving. A small corner of it was being lifted, slowly, tentatively, from the inside. A single, pale, and perfectly rendered finger emerged from behind the fabric, then another, and another, until a full, spectral hand was visible, its form slightly distorted by the heavy cloth it was pushing against. It was the hand of the reflection, a hand that should not have been able to interact with the physical world. And the hand was not just pushing. It was beckoning. Its fingers curled and uncurled in a slow, deliberate, and unmistakable gesture of invitation. It was a gesture that was both seductive and terrifying, a silent, insistent summons. It was beckoning to her, the real Anna, the one who was watching, the one who was free. It was no longer just a prisoner. It was a siren, and its song was a silent, hypnotic gesture that promised a terrible, unimaginable intimacy. The blanket had not been a shield. It had been a veil, and the thing on the other side was now slowly, patiently, and deliberately pulling it away. Her rational mind fought back with a desperate, frantic energy. It could not be real. The smiling, waving, and beckoning reflection was a phantom, an illusion, a trick of a flawed and unreliable technology. She threw herself into research, spending hours online, searching for a scientific explanation that could contain the encroaching, supernatural horror. She found a possible culprit, the rolling shutter effect, a common phenomenon in cameras with CMOS sensors, where fast-moving objects can appear warped, skewed, or delayed. It was a plausible, scientific-sounding explanation, and she clung to it like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was the camera. It had to be the camera. Her cheap, consumer-grade webcam was not designed for the precise, objective documentation she was demanding of it. Its low-quality lens, its slow processor, its aggressive video compression algorithms, they were all conspiring to create this elaborate, terrifying illusion. She convinced herself of this. The reflection was not a conscious entity, it was a digital ghost, a phantom born of faulty code and cheap electronics. The theory was a shield, a fragile but necessary defense against the encroaching madness, and she held it before her with a grim, white-knuckled determination. But to truly silence the fear, to banish the ghost once and for all, she needed more than a theory. She needed proof. She needed an expert witness, an objective observer with a better, more reliable set of eyes. She called her friend, Mark, a professional cinematographer with a cynical, no-nonsense attitude and a deep, abiding faith in the power of high-end camera equipment. He was the perfect person to demystify her haunting, to reduce her terrifying, supernatural experience to a simple, boring technical flaw. She invited him over, framing her request as a strange, technical curiosity, carefully omitting the true depth of her terror. He arrived that evening with a collection of heavy, imposing Pelican cases, a traveling arsenal of professional-grade cinematic technology. He listened to her rambling, edited-down explanation of the reflection glitches, with an amused, slightly condescending smile, the look of a seasoned professional indulging the fanciful notions of a naive amateur. He unpacked his equipment with a calm, practiced efficiency, transforming her small, haunted bedroom into a miniature film set. He was not here to hunt a ghost, he was here to troubleshoot a technical problem, and his confidence was infectious. He set up a high-speed camera, a sleek, black marvel of engineering, on a heavy, stable tripod. Its lens was a huge, perfect circle of high-quality glass, a single, unblinking eye that promised to capture the world with an absolute, unwavering objectivity. He set up a couple of small, professional-grade LED lights, carefully positioning them to create a clean, even, and shadowless illumination, eliminating the very possibility of the tricks of the light she had tried so desperately to convince herself were the cause of the anomaly. This was not a surveillance setup, it was a laboratory. He connected the camera to a powerful laptop, ensuring the video feed would be recorded in a raw, uncompressed format, a pure, unadulterated stream of digital information, free from the very compression artifacts she had clung to as her last, best hope. He checked his light meters, adjusted his focus, and then, with a final, satisfied nod, he declared the setup complete. "If there's a glitch," he said, his voice full of the easy confidence of a man who implicitly trusts his tools, "this will see it. There's no hiding from 120 frames per second." Anna felt a profound sense of relief, a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought her to tears. The sight of the professional equipment, the sound of Mark's calm, technical jargon, the sterile, scientific atmosphere he had created in her room, it was all a powerful antidote to the creeping, supernatural dread that had been poisoning her life. The fear began to recede, replaced by a feeling of slight embarrassment, a sense of foolishness for having allowed her imagination to run so wild, for having been so thoroughly spooked by a simple, mundane technical flaw. She went to bed that night with a feeling of quiet optimism. Mark would be sleeping on the couch in the living room, a silent, reassuring presence just a few feet away. The high-speed camera would be her sentinel, its unblinking, objective eye standing guard over her sleep, ready to capture the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Tomorrow, she and Mark would review the footage, and they would find the glitch. They would pinpoint the exact technical reason for the anomaly, and they would have a good laugh about it. Tomorrow, the nightmare would be over. Tomorrow, science would win. As she drifted off to sleep, the low, almost imperceptible hum of the camera's cooling fan was a comforting, hypnotic sound. It was the sound of logic, of reason, of a world that operated according to a set of knowable, predictable physical laws. The ghost in the glass was about to have its close-up, and she was confident that, under the harsh, unforgiving scrutiny of Mark's professional-grade camera, it would be revealed for what it truly was, a figment, a phantom, a simple and easily explainable trick of the light. The fear was gone, replaced by the calm, reassuring certainty of a scientific mind on the verge of a definitive, and deeply comforting, discovery. They sat together in front of the laptop the next morning, a shared sense of nervous anticipation hanging in the air. Mark was still confident, but Anna's own fear, which had been so effectively suppressed by the presence of the professional equipment, was beginning to creep back in. The video file was huge, a testament to the sheer, unadulterated quality of the recording. Mark opened it, and they began to scrub through the long, silent hours of the night. The image was, as he had promised, crystal clear. Every detail of her room was rendered in a stark, high-definition clarity. There would be no hiding in the shadows of ambiguity this time. At 2:47 in the morning, the event began. Her sleeping body, a pale figure in the perfectly lit room, rose from the bed. The movement was slow, fluid, and captured with a perfect, cinematic smoothness. Her sleepwalking self walked, as it had on so many nights before, toward the mirror. Mark leaned forward, his professional curiosity piqued, a small, intrigued smile on his face. He was about to witness the glitch she had told him about. Anna held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The moment of truth had arrived. And the truth was a nightmare. The anomaly did not just repeat itself, it had amplified, escalated, and transformed into something monstrously, undeniably real. On the flawless, scientifically objective recording, the thing in the mirror was no longer just a lagging, glitching copy. It was a completely separate and autonomous entity. As her physical body stood motionless before the mirror, a blank, sleeping statue, the reflection began to move. It paced back and forth within the confines of the mirror's frame, its movements sharp, agitated, and full of a palpable, intelligent purpose. Mark's amused smile vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes wide, his cynical, rational mind struggling to process the impossible images it was receiving. The reflection was not a reflection. It was a performer on a two-dimensional stage, and it was putting on a show. It sat down on the floor of its reflected room while her own body remained standing. It gestured, it mimed, it moved with a theatrical, mocking grace that was a grotesque parody of her own movements. It was taunting them, a silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying mime artist. Anna felt a strange, detached calm descend upon her. The fear was so immense, so absolute, that it had gone beyond the normal human capacity for terror and had entered a realm of pure, surreal abstraction. She was no longer a participant in this horror, she was an observer, a scientist, just like Mark. They were two rational human beings, witnessing a fundamental and irrefutable violation of the known laws of physics. The evidence was right there, in glorious, uncompressed high definition. The ghost was real, and it had just been captured, for the first time in history, on a professional-grade cinema camera. And then, the moment that shattered even that detached, scientific calm. The moment that would haunt Mark's dreams for the rest of his life. The camera, which had been locked off on a tripod, began to move. It was a slow, smooth, pre-programmed pan, a motion Mark must have set up the night before to capture a wider view of the room. The camera's unblinking eye panned away from the mirror, across the empty space of the bedroom, and toward the bed. And as it did, it performed a simple, cinematic trick that revealed a truth more terrifying than anything they had seen so far. The camera's movement created a brief, dizzying moment of parallax, where the viewer could see both the reflection in the mirror and the object it was supposed to be reflecting at the same time. The camera showed the reflection of Anna, standing stock still before the mirror, its head tilted, its eyes locked directly onto the camera's lens, its face a mask of cold, intelligent curiosity. It was a chilling, perfect image. And then, as the camera's pan continued, it revealed the source of that reflection. It revealed the spot in the real room where her physical body was supposed to be standing. But the spot was empty. The physical, real-world Anna was not there. The camera's pan continued, moving past the empty spot where she should have been, and settled on her bed. And the bed was also empty, its sheets a rumpled, undisturbed landscape. The physical, sleepwalking Anna had vanished. She was not in the room. She was not in the bed. She was nowhere to be seen. The only Anna in the room was the one in the mirror, the one who was now staring out at them from her two-dimensional prison, the sole and undisputed occupant of the bedroom. The coffee cup dropped from Mark's nerveless fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor, the dark liquid spreading like a pool of blood. The sound was an obscenity in the silent, horrified room. He made a small, choking sound, a noise that was half a gasp and half a sob. He was a man whose entire life, whose entire profession, was based on the objective, mechanical reproduction of reality. And he had just recorded a piece of footage that proved that reality was a fragile, negotiable, and utterly terrifying illusion. The image on the screen was a perfect, cinematic impossibility. A reflection with no source. A ghost on film. Anna did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stared at the screen, at the image of the empty room and the solitary, watchful figure in the mirror. She was looking at a visual confirmation of a truth she had already begun to suspect in the deepest, most terrified corners of her soul. She was not the one who was haunted. She was the one who was haunting. The sleepwalker, the nocturnal wanderer, the ghost who rented her body, was not the entity in the mirror. It was her. And the other, the calm, intelligent, and now solitary figure in the glass, was the one who was real. The two of them, the real and the reflected, had been sharing a body, a life, a single, temporal existence. And last night, in the sterile, objective glare of Mark's professional-grade camera, a separation had occurred. A division. A final, and seemingly permanent, transfer of ownership. The ghost had been exorcised. But it had not been banished to some distant, spiritual realm. It had been banished to the real world. And the original, the true, the real Anna, was now the one who was trapped, a silent, eternal prisoner in the cold, two-dimensional world behind the glass. The reflection was no longer a copy. It was the original. And she was now just a memory, a ghost, a reflection of a life she could no longer claim as her own. She woke up the next morning, and the world was different. The low-grade, persistent anxiety that had been her constant companion for weeks, a dull, aching hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, was gone. In its place was a profound and unfamiliar sense of calm. She felt rested, truly rested, for the first time in as long as she could remember. She felt a strange, quiet confidence, a sense of being fully and completely present in her own skin. She felt whole, as if a missing piece of herself, a piece she hadn't even been consciously aware was gone, had finally, silently, clicked back into place. She got out of bed, her movements fluid and graceful, free from the usual morning stiffness and hesitation. She walked across the room, and her eyes fell upon the mirror. She looked at her own reflection, and for the first time in weeks, she felt no fear. She saw only herself, a single, unified being, her movements and the movements of the figure in the glass in perfect, absolute synchrony. The other was gone. The silent, watchful presence, the mocking, menacing entity, had vanished. The mirror was just a mirror again, a simple, inert object, a piece of silvered glass on the wall. Her gaze then fell upon the professional camera, still standing on its tripod like a silent, metal sentinel. She looked at the laptop on her desk, its screen dark, the impossible evidence of the previous night's events stored safely within its memory. She felt no desire to review the footage again. She didn't need to. The knowledge of what had happened was not a memory, it was a part of her now, an innate, cellular understanding of the new shape of her reality. The scientific experiment was over. The conclusion had been reached. And the evidence now needed to be destroyed. She sat down at the desk, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not open the video file. She simply dragged the icon to the trash. She then did the same with all the other folders, the ones containing the grainy, low-resolution footage from her own, cheaper camera. She systematically erased every last digital trace of her nightly ordeal. And then, for good measure, she initiated a full reformat of the computer's hard drive, a deep, digital cleansing that would wipe away not just the files, but the very memory of their existence. She was erasing the past, creating a clean, blank slate for her new, more integrated future. She no longer needed proof. She no longer needed to understand the how or the why of the phenomenon. She simply knew. She knew that the division within herself, the strange, nocturnal schism that had plagued her since childhood, was over. The sleepwalker, the ghost who had borrowed her body, was gone, integrated back into the whole. And the thing in the mirror, the cold, intelligent, and resentful copy, had been vanquished, its separate consciousness erased, its brief, terrifying rebellion brought to a final, silent end. She had won. She was, at last, completely and utterly alone in her own body. She felt a surge of quiet, confident energy, the feeling of a patient who has just recovered from a long and debilitating fever. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid, the sounds sharper. She was seeing and hearing everything as if for the first time, through a new and unfiltered set of senses. She was no longer a host to a parasite, she was a sovereign, the sole and undisputed ruler of her own physical and mental landscape. The curse, the ancient, secret affliction, was finally, truly broken. She was free. She spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet, blissful normalcy. She cleaned her apartment, she read a book, she listened to music. She did all the simple, mundane things that had felt so fraught with a hidden, secondary meaning just a day before. She did not think about Mark, about the shattered coffee cup, about the look of pure, mind-breaking terror on his face. He was a part of the past she had just erased, a casualty of a war that was now over. His terror was his own to deal with. Her journey was now a solitary one. That evening, as she was sitting in the living room, the television in the corner of the empty bedroom turned itself on. The sound was a soft, almost imperceptible click, followed by the low, electrical hum of a warming cathode ray tube. The screen flickered to life, its dark, reflective surface momentarily acting as a mirror, capturing a brief, distorted, fisheye image of the room behind it. For a fraction of a second, the screen reflected the bedroom. It showed the neatly made, and empty, bed. It showed the large, elegant, full-length mirror on the opposite wall. But in the reflection of that mirror, the mirror on the television screen, there was a profound and terrifying absence. The bed, which was visible in the television's primary reflection, was not visible in the secondary, reflected inner reflection image. The mirror on the wall, as seen through the lens of the television screen, was not reflecting the room. It was reflecting nothing. It was a blank, empty, and lightless void. And then the television screen filled with the bright, colorful static of an untuned channel, the image was gone, and the low, comforting sound of white noise filled the silent, empty apartment.